Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those joining us from different parts of the world. As we're all joining, please keep your microphones on mute and feel free to leave your cameras on or off as you prefer. I'll give everyone just a moment to get settled, and then we can begin today's webinar. So welcome and thank you for joining us for this presentation today. I'm Shana Warren and I am the research scientist for Path to Scale Research at Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA. IPA is a research and policy nonprofit that discovers and promotes effective solutions to global problems with a presence in 22 offices around the world. IPA's Path to Scale research program works to initiate and speed up the process of moving evidence-based interventions from proof of concept innovations to scalable and adaptable programs and policies. We are holding today's webinar with Evidence in Governance and Politics, or EGAP. EGAP is a research, evaluation, and learning network that promotes rigorous knowledge accumulation, innovation, and evidence-based policy in various governance and accountability domains. IPA is a proud member of EGAP. So for today's webinar, formalization, as we'll hear today, is the process of bringing citizens into official contact and engagement with the state, allowing them to access more government services, yet obligating them to pay taxes and service fees. Despite the importance of tax compliance for increasing the ability of governments to provide needed services, so far there's been limited research into when and how informational interventions can increase formalization and subsequent tax compliance in lower and middle income countries. This is a pressing policy need in contexts where both the size of the informal sector and the need for increased government revenue is quite large. It's for this reason that it's particularly exciting to be here today to discuss the findings of impact evaluations that were carried out in a coordinated way across 6 countries. I'm now going to introduce our great lineup of presenters for today. First, we have Professor Ana de la O, Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale University and the EGAP Taxation Metaketa Committee Chair. She will present the findings on this multi-country study on taxation and formalization. We're also honored to be joined by Juan Sebastián Robledo Botero, Director of Innovation and Private Sector Development from the Colombia Department of National Planning, who will reflect on what this research means for practitioners and policymakers. After our panelists have made their presentations, we'll have a brief Q&A period. For today's webinar, if you have a question or comment, you can type it into the Q&A box, which should be available on Zoom. After Anna's presentation, we will move on directly to Juan Sebastián's analysis. I want to mention that we are recording this session and may make it publicly available on our websites. Thank you very much, and I will pass the baton to Anna.
Great, thank you, Shana, so much, and thank all of you for connecting to this webinar. I'm very happy to be here presenting on behalf of my co-authors, and I'll give you more information about our team a little bit later in the talk. And before getting started, I want to again thank Shana for moderating this event, and also to Juan Sebastián for generously agreeing to participate in the event. In this talk, what I would like to do are 3 things. So first, I'm going to start giving you a very brief overview of the EGAP network and our Metaketa initiative. And then I'm going to spend most of my time describing 6 coordinated field experiments that we conducted on the topic of formalization and taxation. And I will end up talking about some of the policy implications of our findings. The evidence in governance and politics, it's a global network of researchers. Our objective is to promote the rigorous accumulation of knowledge, innovation, and evidence-based policy in various governance and accountability domains. We seek to forge partnerships between researchers and practitioners to further our understanding of the politics of global development and improving the quality of empirical research in the social sciences. Our Metaketa initiative is a collaborative research model aimed at improving the accumulation of knowledge using field experiments. The Metaketa round that I'm going to discuss today is one of 4 Metaketas that has already been completed. These projects have explored topics that go from information and accountability, natural resource governance, and community policing. The project that I'm going to discuss today started from the observation that many countries in the global south seem to be trapped in a negative cycle in which governments are unresponsive and unaccountable to borders, and on the other hand, borders pay few taxes. And taxation is thought to be crucial for development, not only because it endows governments with resources to provide public services, but also because it might encourage borders to demand accountability from their governments. Indeed, one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is to improve countries' capacity for tax and other revenue collection. And there are multiple paths to try to achieve this target. In this project, we drew inspiration from the argument that perhaps establishing a fiscal contract in which governments provide public goods in exchange for taxation is essential to break this negative cycle. But as De Soto popularized, we know that informal businesses and people living in informal settlements and households that lack access to public services face additional hurdles to enter into a type of fiscal contract with their governments, because before paying taxes, they need to formalize. And just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, the informal sector accounts for between 1/3 and 2/3 of the economic activity in low and middle income countries. And according to International Property Rights Index, last year, about 4.3 billion people had weak property rights and were locked out from the formal economy. So our Metaketa round speaks to 3 interrelated questions. So the first one is whether there is a demand in low and middle income countries for business licenses, property titles, or government services. And if so, what prevents people who would otherwise formalize from doing so? And lastly, does formalization indeed lead to more tax compliance? In our project, we are connecting 2 strands of academic work. On one hand, there's an argument, both in political science and in economics, that a fiscal contract might create the right sort of tax morale among people so that they willingly pay taxes. And a growing strand of empirical work has tested various interventions that try different types of tax morale appeals to improve tax compliance with mixed results. Crucially, most of this work has focused on tax evasion. So in a way, the assumption is that people are already in the tax rolls. So it's unclear if the results of these studies apply to contexts where people first need to formalize. On the other hand, we are also building on a recent and exciting research program that has found with single case field experiments that reducing the upfront transaction costs of firms helps them to register. And although these results are very encouraging, it is still an open question whether more registration actually leads to more tax compliance. And also it's unclear whether the results of these studies apply to other contexts, and also if they apply to other types of exchanges between governments and citizens. So our interventions are demand-side interventions to promote formalization. These interventions had a coordinated treatment arm where people received information about the benefits and the costs of formalization, and an offer of assistance to reduce the upfront transaction costs of formalization. We measure the effects on whether people try to formalize, whether governments effectively supply formalization, and lastly, whether people end up paying more taxes. And to give you a preview of the results, what we find is that across these sites, there are both demand and supply side barriers to formalization. So starting with the first question of whether there is a demand among the public for formalization, we found no overall significant effects with a meta-analysis, but we do find significant heterogeneity across sites. And I will offer an interpretation of this heterogeneity that would underscore the importance of the benefits that governments are offering in exchange for taxation. On the question of whether governments supply formalization, we don't find an overall positive effect either, and we do find significant variation here, suggesting that even interventions that successfully increase people's intent to formalize could be derailed by resistance from the bureaucracy. And to the last question of whether these types of interventions increase tax compliance, we find no overall effects and we do not find significant heterogeneity. Indeed, from our 6 studies, we only find an effect on compliance in one of them. And I'll describe more our results in a bit later in the talk. All right, so our projects follow the Metaketa model quite closely. We have a steering committee conformed by Don Green from Columbia University, Peter John from King's College London, and myself. And we have 6 groups of principal investigators that implemented the studies in Brazil, Colombia, Nigeria, Malawi, DRC, and India. From the start, researchers coordinated on the common treatment arm intervention and importantly, also on the measurement of the relevant variables. And this coordination efforts is what allows us to put together all these studies in a meta-analysis. To increase transparency and avoid publication bias, all of these projects have pre-analysis plans that are pre-registered. Data and replication codes will be publicly available upon publication of the studies, and all the codes and data were reviewed by third-party researchers to catch up any mistakes. These sites that we have here clearly are very different. They are diverse. We have low-income countries, we have middle-income countries. But interestingly, they face a common problem. In all of these sites, formalization rates are very low. In the 3 studies of firm formalization, formalization rates was between 10 to 20% of the small firms were registered in the control group at endline. In the DRC, no one in the control group had actually managed to acquire a property title on their own in the control group at endline. And in the studies in Malawi and Nigeria, which focused on access to public services, very few people actually had access to these services in the control group at endline. And this goes hand with the fact that in this context, there are key elements of the fiscal contract-like mentality that are missing. And just to give you a sense, I want to talk about 2 variables that come from our surveys. We ask our respondents, and here I'm focusing on the control group because these were the subjects that received no intervention. We ask people whether they perceive that the state would actually come and solve a problem caused by an adverse negative shock to their communities. This is a hypothetical question. And in all of these sites, a majority of people mentioned that the state would not resolve the problem. And in fact, most of them responded that it's not that the government lacked resources, but it's lack of willingness that would explain the lack of responsiveness. Now, moreover, in this study, in these sites, except for Brazil, most people have the perception that corruption is widespread. So as I'm showing you in the last graph in this figure, a majority of respondents said that they perceive that the government would waste or steal most of the budget, with the important exception, as I mentioned, of Brazil. We have, in our study, mixed 3 types of formalization processes. So on one hand, we have 3 studies that focus on firm registration, Brazil, Colombia, and Nigeria. We have 1 study that focuses on the regularization of property or acquiring a property title in the DRC Congo. And we have 2 studies that focus on acquiring formal access to a public service, India and Malawi. And at this point, you may be wondering, what do we gain from mixing these different types of formalizations? So let me just say a few words about that. Our idea was that by combining firm registration with these other types of formalization, we could get, in a way, some perspective on an interesting but understated aspect of the political economy of formalization. Because as we know from previous work, it is oftentimes the case that for small businesses, it doesn't pay off in terms of profits or access to credit to register. So these small businesses oftentimes do not see these types of benefits materialize. So then here the question is whether governments can make formalization appealing by offering some type of benefits or policies that would convince this type of firm to join the formal sector. So in this sense, what we see is that these three types of formalization present people with sort of a similar choice between entering into a formal exchange with their governments, in which, of course, there are some costs and benefits, or not. So our interventions aim to help citizens who lack information about the requirements to formalize, or who may perceive that the formalization process is onerous in terms of time and effort, or they might not have in their top of their minds what types of benefits or government benefits are associated with formalization. So our interventions try to help this group of people to formalize. The bundle treatment then aim to remove upfront transaction cost type barriers that would impede people who would want to formalize from doing so. The first component of the intervention was at least one in-person visit where individuals receive information about the process of formalization, the costs and benefits, and then they received an offer of assistance to navigate the formalization process. At a very minimum, this component included help to identify which are the required documents that they need to put together to complete the process, assistance to fill in the forms, and to locate the nearest office to submit the paperwork. And the outcomes that we focus on this paper are intent to formalize, formalization, and tax compliance. So what I want to do next is give you a little bit more detail on each of the interventions, and I'm going to highlight some of the variations that the teams had to implement to adapt the common treatment arm to their specific context. And I'm going to start with the three studies about firm formalization. So one of these studies took place in Brazil. The group of PIs was confirmed by Goldsmith, Lenz, Valdivia, and Suco Jr. They partnered with the Getulio Vargas Foundation, and their location was Rio de Janeiro. This team focused on formalization as a MEI, a small firm. The MEI program, the Individual Micro-Entrepreneur Program, is a subsidized way to formalize a small business in Brazil. The government services that were highlighted in this intervention was subsidized access to Social Security. And in terms of the free assistance, the team offered help to small firms to both identify what were documents that they needed, fill in the forms, and if the firms were eligible, to submit those forms online. The other firm formalization study that we had was conducted in Colombia. The team was composed by Christensen and Garfias, and IPA was the implementing partner. The location of this study was Casuca, which is a low-income suburb of Bogota. And here the team focused on formalization of small firms with the Chamber of Commerce. Here, the government services that were highlighted in their intervention was access to cheap credit, the fact that formal firms can have a unique name, and that they face a lower risk of penalty for operating without a license. And they had a similar setup where they offer assistance for people to figure out what forms, what documents they require, and where they need to submit the forms. The last of the studies on firm formalization took place in Nigeria. The PIs were Gottlieb, Levas, Magat, and Obiliki. They partnered with the Center for Public Policy Alternatives and the Lagos Internal Revenue Service. Their location was Lagos. And they focused here on the formalization of market vendors who require an ETC card, which is an electronic tax card, to operate, and they should be paying taxes. But of course, a lot of the market vendors do not have an ETC. The government services that were underscored in this intervention was access to secondary education, which the government is now trying to make contingent on people paying taxes, and the possibility of applying for government loans. Here in Nigeria, it was particularly important to offer this information in multiple languages. So NGO workers offered information in the vendor's native language. So now I'm going to talk about the project in DRC, which focused on formalization of property. A majority of property owners in Kananga do not have a property title. And as part of this study, the provincial government approved a program which offered lower prices and less hassle cost to process one of 3 different types of property titles. The government services underscore here were the fact that property titles offer more legal certainty. And here, on top of the harmonized component of the studies in terms of free assistance, the team also offered an on-site eligibility assessment to help residents figure out if they would qualify to start this process of acquiring a property title. And they offered assistance to navigate the bureaucracy. Sorry, and the team here in DRC is Balan, Bergeron, Turek, and Wigan. And now I'm going to describe the 2 studies that focus on access to formal services. And the first of these studies took place in India. The PIs were Wakard, Nellis, and Thomas, and they partnered with 2 NGOs with experience in working with water connections in Mumbai, Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action, and Panikak Samiti. Here, they focused on trying to help people process a water connection, a municipal water connection. And the problem in this location is that a majority of slum residents lack access to pipe water because the process is very complicated. Crucially, this intervention was made possible by a very important decision by the courts that declared that the governments cannot deny slums access to water. So here, the NGOs work with the PIs to have a campaign, face-to-face sessions to try to help people apply for these water connections. The government services is, of course, the access to water, but it's important here to keep in mind that municipal water in this context is both more affordable and higher quality water than what people can get in the informal sector. And the component of assistance was a little bit more involved because, of course, this process was more complicated. So here the teams offer assistance to conform groups of about 5 to 10 households that would jointly submit an application for a water connection. And they help people figure out other ancillary requirements of this process, like a proof of residence and the paperwork of the slums. And crucially, they help them obtain approval of a licensed plumber to move forward with the formalization process. And the last study took place in Malawi. Here the team was conformed by Bowers, Chen, Grady, and Winters. Their partners were the Samba City government and the Institute for Public Opinion and Research. The location was Samba. And in Samba, residents are required to pay a city fee, but very few do so. As part of this study, the government provided free waste collection services to all the experimental sample to demonstrate that they could actually provide this type of services. And in the face-to-face sessions, then the teams deliver information about the city fee and the types of services that the government can provide if they have resources to do so. And the free assistance included information about the availability of bank transfers to pay the city fee, and also, and perhaps very importantly, information about the city's council tax forgiveness plan, which could have removed a big obstacle if people do not want to even try to pay the city fee because they think that they would have to pay all the taxes that they haven't paid in the past. All right, so from the very beginning, we coordinated the data collection. So most of these studies have a baseline and an endline survey, and the measurement of the most important variables was harmonized. Some of these studies also collected administrative data or verified self-reported data when possible. These are all field experiments, so people were assigned to the various experimental conditions randomly. And what we are going to show you next is the estimates of these interventions side by side, and we do that comparing averages across treatment and control groups with OLS regressions. And then I'm going to aggregate all of this together with a meta-analysis, and I'm using here a random effects model. All right, so on the findings, our first outcome, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, is intent to formalize. Here, the outcome, just as a reminder, is defined as whether people initiated the process of formalization or declared interest in formalizing. And what we found is that overall, with the meta-analysis, these interventions led to a 9.3 percentage point increase in intent to formalize, but these estimates are not significantly different from zero. And we find substantive heterogeneity across sites. So as you can see in this graph here, in the DRC, the intervention led to a 30 percentage point increase in people's intent to formalize, in India to an 11 percentage point increase, and in Brazil to a 5.5 percentage point increase in intent to formalization. In Malawi and Colombia, these estimates are centered around zero. In Nigeria, we unfortunately do not have this outcome due to an unfortunate mistake in the skip pattern in the survey, but I'm happy to talk a bit more about that in the Q&A. Our second outcome is formalization. And here, just as a reminder, people who manage to complete the process of formalization are coded as having formalized. So this would mean, in particular, for instance, for the firm registration studies, that the firm ends up in the tax rolls. In India is whether people actually have a water connection. In Malawi is whether people pay city fees at endline. And in the DRC is whether people have a property title in their hands at endline. Overall, with the meta-analysis, what we find is that the interventions led to a 3 percentage point increase in formalization, but as you can see, the estimates are not statistically different from zero, that 95% confidence interval crosses zero. And the other very interesting thing here is that we find that there is a lot of slippage between intent to formalize and formalization. So take, for instance, the case of DRC. In the DRC, the intervention, as I mentioned before, led to a 30 percentage point increase in intent to formalize. But in terms of formalization, it only increased this outcome by 8.5 percentage points. And dramatically, also in India, intent to formalize increased it by 11 percentage points, but formalization did not move. So we see that that coefficient is centered around zero in this graph. In Brazil, the intervention led to a 6.8 percentage point increase in actual formalization. And in Malawi, Colombia, and Nigeria, we see that the intervention did not lead to a statistically significant effect. On our third outcome about tax compliance, and here tax compliance is defined as whether people pay the relevant tax, city fee, or utility fee at endline. What we find is that overall, there is almost no effect of this intervention. There's a 0.7 percentage point increase. So it's a very close to zero type of effect. The standard error here is 0.8. So really no overall effect on tax compliance. And we do not find substantive heterogeneity across sites. All of these estimates are centered around zero. The only exception is Brazil, where we do find that the intervention led to a 4.6 percentage point increase in people paying the May fee 2 months after being formalized. And the one caveat that I want to highlight on these results, and particularly for the case of DRC, is that perhaps not enough time elapsed between the intervention and the measurement of the outcomes. And importantly, in 2019, the government did not conduct a door-to-door campaign to collect taxes. So that perhaps should be something to keep in mind when thinking about this null effect. All right, so overall, what I have shown is that there is no impact on intent to formalize and tax compliance of these demand type of interventions. But I think that the substantive site heterogeneity that we have do speak to what works where. And so what I want to do next is offer you an interpretation of what could account for the heterogeneity that we're finding across sites. Then I will offer two alternative interpretations that are less compatible with our results. And then I'm going to move to the policy implications of our results. And I just want to be sort of upfront here to say that I'm moving into a more descriptive part of the talk, because we do not have random assignment of different types of benefits within studies, so that we could actually test the exact mechanism that is underpinning this heterogeneity. All right, so what we think is that this heterogeneity is very much compatible with a framework of cost benefits. But I think that what we are trying to underscore here is that benefits should be thought in a very broad sense, and not just whether the firms have an increase in profits, but what types of benefits are they receiving from the government. So here, the three important questions to think from the perspective of individuals is whether people benefit from formalization. Can they access similar benefits than what the government offers in exchange for formalization in the informal sector? And are there any type of collective action problems present? So let me speak a little bit more about that. And here, what we see as coming up clearly from our cases is that it makes a difference whether governments are offering tangible individual benefits compared to benefits of uncertain relevance. So think for a moment about the three cases where we actually find that the interventions increase the intent of people to formalize. In India, having a formal water connection actually increases access to affordable and higher quality water. One of the most common alternatives for people to access water is to buy piped water from the so-called water mafias that charge exorbitant prices for water. So in this sense, it is from people, it is preferable to have a water connection and pay for that water compared to buy the water from the mafias. In Brazil, formalization is tied to very valuable social security, which might not have a substitute in the informal sector, or as valuable substitute in the informal sector. And in the DRC, property titles give legal certainty to people, and here it's important to keep in mind that having this type of title in hand can really help people if they, for some reason, have to go to the courts and defend their property. Now, on the other hand, we have the cases of Colombia and Nigeria. And in both of these cases, it could very well be that the benefits of formalization are of uncertain relevance. And just think for a moment about the case of Colombia, where the benefits of formalization were things like your store can have a unique name, you can engage with other formal firms. You could perhaps sell goods and services to the government. And the problem with all of these benefits is that probably they would be more appealing to firms of a bigger size than small firms. And in Nigeria, the benefits that the government is trying to tie to formalization, like access to secondary education, might or might not be relevant to market vendors. So in that sense, having these benefits of uncertain relevance do not encourage people to formalize. And Malawi shows a different type of problem. In Malawi, the benefits that the government is offering in exchange for the city fee are collective. And here, even though people in the abstract mention that they do want formal trash collection, and this is something that our PIs heard on the field in preliminary fieldwork, turns out that people are not willing to pay for it. And the challenge here is that for residents, there are alternatives in the informal sector that are free, like dumping trash, which is of course not socially optimal, but is free and is socially acceptable, and it's preferred by most residents. So here we have a collective action problem that is preventing people to see that there are some benefits to formalization. Okay, now briefly on two alternative interpretations of what could be going here that we think are less compatible with our results. On one hand, you could think that maybe what is happening is that it's perceptions of state capacity and corruption that are preventing people to even think that it's appealing to enter into a fiscal contract. And here, I would just would like to note that the three cases in which we actually find positive effects in terms of intent to formalize are also cases where people report in surveys that their government is unwilling to solve their community problems. And in India and DRC, respondents report very high levels of perceived corruption. So even though there are these types of perceptions among respondents, they still found it appealing to formalize when the benefits of formalization were tangible. The other type of interpretation that we think that is less compatible with our heterogeneity across studies is that maybe only the studies that had lower upfront cost produce positive effects. And here in India and DRC, where we found the largest effects on intent to formalize, what we also know is that people face the highest upfront costs of formalization. On the other hand, in Nigeria and Malawi, where we do not find an effect on intent to formalize, we know that the tax liability is equal or less than Brazil's May fee. So we think that this type of interpretation is less compatible with what we're finding. Now, from the point of view of governments, the cost-benefit framework also helps to figure out what's going on. And here the two questions that are worthwhile thinking about is whether politicians and bureaucrats benefit from formalization, and do they see it in their interest to complete the simplified procedures. And the cases of DRC speak very clearly to these dynamics. In the case of DRC, there was initial support from the regional government to have this simplified titling program that had reduced prices. But then relevant bureaucracies blocked the process in two ways. So first, the land ministry restricted eligibility criteria after the launch of the program. And second of all, some legal and cadastral officers stalled the implementation of the program. And we think it's because this simplified program reduced their discretion at certain steps of the title pipeline. As a result, the intervention took almost 15 months more than originally planned. And actually, a national minister had to intervene to enable the program to move forward. So in a way, in this case, formalization needed a bureaucratic champion. And in the case of India, As I mentioned before, the intervention was successful in increasing intent to formalize. It also increased the number of visits by BMC water officials, which is an intermediate step in the process. But burdensome and sometimes unanticipated procedures ended up impeding water connections. We think that some of this is explained by perhaps the water mafias acting behind the scenes to sabotage some of the intervention um, actions. And also this team faced multiple challenges and logistical challenges, including the fact that there were national and state elections, citizens protests, and there was little impetus to restart halted projects after these political events. All right, so in terms of the policy implications of these results, I guess the first thing to note is that I think that what our results are showing is that in terms of promoting formalization and tax compliance, it's very important to figure out where does the process of formalization break down. So if, for instance, there is no demand among the public for formalization, then I guess what we are suggesting is that it's important to figure out why not. And it could be that if there are no tangible individual benefits for formalization, then the government would have to figure out how to offer offsetting compensation to make it appealing for people to formalize. Reducing costs and streamlining processes, it's certainly necessary, but it might not be sufficient. As our sites show, in many of these cases, the processes of formalization had already been simplified by administrative reforms before our studies, but still there were some upfront costs that were preventing people from formalizing. So it could be that governments have to do a sort of door-to-door campaign to bring people into the formal sector, and that of course opens up questions about the cost effectiveness of these interventions and how to design them to properly incentivize agents to conduct this type of campaigns. Now, we also think that if the benefits that governments are offering in exchange for taxation are public goods, then governments need to figure out how to minimize collective action problems and maybe free riding, and try as much as possible to outweigh the value of the services that exist in the informal sector as alternatives to what the government is providing. On the second question of whether governments provide formalization, if the barrier is at this stage, we think that it's important to really take into account what are the incentives for street level bureaucrats and frontline service providers. And if they are not perfectly aligned to the objective of increasing formalization, it might be important to reconsider the incentive structure and maybe improve the interface with population with maybe more technology. And lastly, if the barrier is at the third stage, so once people are already in the tax rolls or in the property registries, if the problem is how to encourage them to comply with taxation, maybe here is the point where some behavioral interventions could help, so making it very easy for people to pay their taxes. And maybe this is also a stage where it might make more sense in terms of like the costs of it to try to improve enforcement. All right, so we, with these 6 randomized controlled trials, have studied behavioral interventions on the demand side that provided information to people about formalization and a reduction of transaction costs. We asked if these types of interventions increase formalization and tax compliance. I guess our overall conclusion is that demand side behavioral interventions could have a better chance to succeed if they take into account the uncertainty about government benefits, potential collective action problems, and bureaucratic interference. So let me leave you with that. And this is a full list of all the amazing PIs in our team. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Juan Sebastián Robledo. I am the Director of Innovation and Private Sector Development at the National Planning Department of Colombia, DNP, which is sort of an economic minister, a ministry of economy, but it's a lot more focused on designing and evaluating long-term and structural policies, and also promoting better coordination among entities within the national government and the national government with regional governments and with the private sector. So first of all, thank you very much to IPA and EGAP for this wonderful opportunity to talk a little bit about formalization. Thank you so much, Anna, for the great presentation, and Shayna for the great introduction. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Just up front, let me say that I'll focus a little bit more on firm formalization, because that's what I've had more experience with. And my job here is to sort of reflect upon some of the key elements for policy design that we can draw from this wonderful work that has been done across so many countries. So I think the key question to think about or to reflect on, to sort of identify the key policy implications is how big are the benefits of the intervention that is being made. A little more on that. It's important to ask, can treated firms really materialize the benefits that are being offered or that are being promoted as part of the intervention? And even more important, how do benefits compare to the costs or the fees that firms have to pay within the intervention? So I think here the comparison between Brazil and Colombia offer a lot of insight. First, in Brazil, the May program is very, very interesting. I think we can all agree that there's a big benefit of being part of the program. It allows firms to formalize in multiple dimensions, in firm registration, social security, and taxes, and within a single payment. And within that payment, there is a subsidy for the social security, which is obviously very valuable. When you compare that with the Colombian case, I think you can draw a big difference. So what are the benefits that are being advertised as part of the program? First, access to cheaper credit. And I think it's important to recognize that that benefit is not really guaranteed, because at the end it's the decision of the lender. So for a bank, it doesn't really matter. I guess it's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for the firm to be registered. And at the end, the decision whether to lend money to a firm will depend more on whether the firm has, a reasonable business model, an expected, a sufficient enough sort of cash flows going forward. So it's not really a benefit that it's tied to registration of the firm. Also, it was advertised that the firm will have a lower risk of penalty. Again, I think that might be even the opposite, because while the firm is completely informal and is not registered, but it's very hard for oversight agencies to identify the firm and penalize it. But once the firm registers, yes, it's true that it won't. The agency in charge of oversight of registration won't penalize that firm, but all other agencies in charge of the oversight of all other sort of requirements of formalization that have to do with social security payments, that have to do with tax payments, will be able to identify the firm now that is registered, and the risk of penalty there will increase dramatically. Now, the other benefit that was advertised was that the firm, once registered, will be able to sell to the government. That is also not an immediate benefit tied with firm registration. Not only because it's no guarantee that the firm will have a service or a product competitive enough to be able to win a public procurement process, but also because to be able to sell to the government, in the specific case of Colombia, firms would need to register in another registry and pay additional fees. Now, free assistance to go through the whole registration process is really a benefit, indeed, but it's not very large when you compare it with the registration fee that for the time of implementation of the project was between $20 and $1,000, depending on the size of the SME. So I think this question of how big is the benefit, how certain is the benefit of the step of formalization that I'm promoting is a key question. I don't know as much on the other sort of types of formalization that were explored in the other projects, but I think we can all agree that, for example, in the case of DRC, a property title can really be a game changer for the lives of people. So I think it's no wonder that a program like that could have a large impact on, at least on the intent of formalization. The same with India. But then afterwards, you have to compare, the size of that benefit with the size of the cost, including the bureaucratic costs, and at the end, you might have different impacts. Okay, so what are the key elements that I think we have to have in mind for policy design to promote formalization? The first one is that formalization is a multidimensional process, not a binary state. It's not a black or white thing, but more like a series of different grays. And for, at least in Colombia, we've sort of grouped all those dimensions across 4 types of formalization. So there's the entrance, which has to do with business licenses, tax registrations, city registrations. Then you have sort of inputs, which have to do more of hiring workforce or the use of land and property titles associated with that. Then you have all the sort of rules around production, so all the environmental and sanitary rules, obligatory quality standards also, and then finally, and this usually is the last steps of this ladder of steps, are everything related to taxation. And this is quite important. So and for example, going back to the Brazilian example, it's very, very interesting that within one single program, you offer firms the ability to formalize across almost most of these different dimensions, and hence no wonder that it has such a big impact on intent of formalization and the taxation aspect. What we've seen is that taxation usually is one of the last steps that firms carry out in that formalization process. And the May program is very interesting in the sense that with that one single payment, you're already allowing the firm to go to that last step. The second element is that, and Anna was highlighted this, is that firms will formalize if they perceive that it will entail more benefits than costs, and not otherwise. So this, cost benefit analysis is really important for firms, and usually, like for example, the project in Colombia, a lot of formalization efforts focus on information and assistance during the bureaucratic process. But I think you have to go a lot deeper and really ask yourself whether, this formalization that you're promoting within firms is in the best interest of the firm, cost benefit wise. Something very important within that is that the ability to materialize the benefits of being formal depends on the level of development or productivity or size of each company. Anna touched upon this, but it's really, really important, and we see it in the Colombian example. A lot of the sort of formalization requirements tend to be necessary, but not sufficient requirement to be able to materialize the benefits of being formal. Firms need to be productive enough, competitive enough, developed enough to materialize some of these key benefits of being formal, like accessing better credit, like selling to the government, like being able to sort of diversify their client base. And then finally, I will highlight the fact that coordination of oversight agencies is really key to create the right incentives for firms. And this is because of the multidimensional aspect of formality. If oversight agencies act like silos, then, very, very negative incentives could be generated for firms to remain completely informal, completely out of sight of all oversight agencies. The good news is that, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this. In Colombia, we've enacted a recent firm formalization policy just last year that takes into account many of these sort of policy recommendations, and I think it starts to head the country into the right direction in terms of firm formalization policies. Just to give you a taste of what we found when we were preparing this policy regarding costs, just so that you get a sense of the magnitude of the costs of being formals for firms in countries like Colombia. So what we found is that the costs of going from completely informal to very much formal across many dimensions normally represents between 1/3 and 1/2 of firms' yearly gross income. So basically, being formal reduces income of firms by either half or 1/3 on a yearly basis. Most of the costs are associated with taxation and labor costs, but also for the smallest firms, for micro firms, the entrance costs are also quite high. So just to think a little bit about this with regards to the key elements that I touched upon earlier, you really have to make a very big effort on the one hand to reduce these costs and make sure that every cost that you sort of ask of a firm, every fee, really has tied to it a very important benefit that will make the firm sort of interested in sorting out that formalization requirement. The policy that we've enacted has 4 priorities. First, it was very apparent, very evident for us that we needed better data on microfirms that are mostly informal. So we've included within the National Household Survey a very interesting module on microenterprise to identify them within the household survey, and we've been able to get very, very nice representative data that we've started using to improve some of our policies. The second one is to really make a big effort on basic firm development to raise productivity of these firms. We have started a pilot project that is running last year, and it's running this year. We're doing sort of an impact evaluation on that project to be able to sort of adjust and scale it up because it's really important that these firms have sort of enough level of firm development to be able to materialize the benefits of formalization, because otherwise it doesn't really matter how low the costs of formalizing are. If you're not able to materialize any benefits for being formal, then the cost benefit will still be negative. Then third, really make a big effort, and I think the margin of improvement here is really big in countries like Colombia, to lower the costs of formalizing across all dimensions of firm formality. We have had some success here. We reduced the registration fee that I mentioned earlier from between $20 to $1,000. We've reduced it to only around $15 for all firms. We've also implemented what we call a simple taxation regime for the smallest companies that has been able to have some success in tax formality. And then fourth, And this is something that we have still had a lot of trouble to have success here, is to implement smart or coordinated oversight. Because as Anna was saying, you know, changing the incentives within governments is also a key thing, and it's very hard. And normally oversight agencies only care about the specific requirement they're overseeing, and sort of generating enough sort of conscience about the fact that the comprehensive oversight that the different agencies make and the way they coordinate is very key, so that the firms really have an incentive to start the formalization process. And that oversight has to give enough time to firms to sort of start ticking the boxes progressively, and not expect that all firms will go from completely informal to completely formal from one day to the next. So anyways, that's are the main points that I wanted to touch upon. But of course, you are very, I encourage you to check out the policy that we've enacted. I think it's a really, really interesting policy where we can all draw a lot of lessons from. I think we've had a lot of challenges in implementing it. So it would be really interesting to keep this discussion going. Please feel free to contact me. There's my contact info, and I'd love to keep chatting about this. Thank you very much.
So first, I would like to thank both Juan Sebastian and Anna for their excellent presentations. I hope that everybody enjoyed them as much as I did. Some questions have come through, and so I would like to begin to open the Q&A and discussion portion of today's webinar. I will remind everyone, if you have additional questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A. I am monitoring that and trying to add them as we go. Broadly, the questions we've seen so far fall into a set about the Metaketa implementation of both the Metaketa project overall and then each individual project, the implications of the findings, and sort of what would be the next steps. So taking things in that order, I'm just going to begin with some of the questions about implementation. So I think the first question would be for Anna, and this is, how did you select the sites and the specific interventions that were discussed in the Metaketa?
Thank you, Shayna. So we followed the Metaketa model quite closely. So we had an open call for projects that were related to the question of formalization and access to public services. With those studies that came our way, we selected the strongest and the ones that were most closely related to this theme of formalization and public services, and that had potential to implement this harmonized treatment arm. So in a way, the specific sites are just a convenient sample that the PI selected based on where they had strong partnerships on the ground. Now, perhaps it's worthwhile also mentioning that within the sites, the PIs exerted a tremendous amount of effort to create sampling frames for their studies, because here we're talking about populations that are not readily legible to the state or other commercial sort of type of directories. And so most of these studies created a mini census of small firms that have like open door policies, or a small census of slum residents. And in the case of DRC, a sort of a small census of property owners. So with that sampling frame, then they randomize their interventions. So that's how the specific samples came to be constructed.
Thank you for that response, Anna. If anybody has any additional follow-up on that, feel free again to add to the Q&A. There was a next question, I think, at the level of detail in the individual projects. We have two questions. First, are the small firms comparable between Colombia and Brazil, these two sites? That question would be for Anna. And then first, I would like to ask Juan Sebastian, when do businesses in Colombia qualify for Social Security after formalization? And I think this goes to sort of the broader question of the distance in time between formalization, which has a cost, and then getting some type of benefit, either collective or individual. I'll pass it to Juan Sebastian.
Thank you, Shayna. Well, that's a great question because right now in Colombia, the two systems go completely separate. I guess the question that is being made is if ever, if sort of an entrepreneur registers his or her firm, then will he have some benefit in terms of Social Security? The question is no, it's completely separate. So that entrepreneur, after registering, would then have to go through its registration of its own Social Security across health, pension, severance payments, etc. And then if he doesn't, and more importantly, if he doesn't sort of register to Social Security any employee that he may have, then he'll have sort of risk of penalty from the different oversight agencies that are looking for compliance across the different sort of subsystems of Social Security.
So I guess to the question of whether the small firms are comparable to each other. So turns out that in the three cases that we have firm registration, Brazil, Colombia, and Nigeria, we are really talking about very small firms. So the average number of employees in Colombia was 1.8, and in Brazil, about 76% of the sample had no employees, and the rest had at most one employee. And in Nigeria, the average number of employees was 2.5. So we're talking about very, very small firms. And it's interestingly that it's in Brazil that we find the positive effects on intent to formalize, and they are among these three studies the smallest of the firms. So I don't think that our results are completely explained by just the size of the firms in our study, but it's a very good question, and to keep in mind, like what are the characteristics of the sample. Thank you.
Just continuing to sort of monitor questions that are coming in. I had a question from Jimmy Ribot, I believe, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, for Juan Sebastian. How can we determine the level of productivity a firm needs to start benefiting from formalization? Does this matter in terms of the sector we're talking about or something else?
Well, that's a great question, and I think I would point out to a wonderful work that has been done by Ulicea, actually in Brazil, and the model he has constructed has been replicated for Colombia by Cristina Fernandez from FEDesarrollo, and what they try to model is that it depends on many issues, but what happens is that if you were to graph sort of productivity across an x-axis and sort of the net income of the firm in the y-axis, for an informal firm, then it would start growing from the start, but then as the firm grows more productive and grows and becomes bigger, the value added that it generates it gets quite small for different reasons, because getting detected by oversight agencies is a lot easier when you're bigger. Even though you're bigger, getting new clients or selling to the government or exporting is not an option. And then comparing that, a firm that is formal, it begins with a net income that is lower because of formality costs. So even if you have productivity zero, the net income will be zero because it has to pay all the costs or all the fees associated with being formal. But as it grows more productive, that net income grows a lot faster than for the informal one. And then there's a point where those two lines crosses, and that would be the point to answer the question. That would be the point at which the net income of the firm would be higher if it's formal than if it's informal. So what you now, what level specifically that is, it depends on each country, it depends on each sector, and these people, Ulicea and Cristina Fernandez for Colombia and Ulicea for Brazil, they've been able to sort of try to calculate what that level is, and but that is, that level of productivity. You can also influencing by reducing the costs, because reducing the cost of being formal will shift that net income line of being formal leftwards, and it will mean that the level of productivity you need for the cost benefit analysis of being formal to be positive will be lower.
Thank you both for these responses. I'd like to move on to another set of questions. We have a question from Anastasia de Santos from USAID. And she notes that the heterogeneity of findings is perhaps not surprising, since the arenas of formality are quite different. How would you explain this? And I can pass this to Anna.
Thank you, Shaina. Yeah, I do see where this question is coming from. We do have various types of formalization and heterogeneity in the results, but what I would like to highlight here is that our heterogeneity in results does not map one-to-one to the types of formalization. So it's not like we're finding a certain types of effects on the firm formalization and a very different type of effects on the other studies. What we are finding is that across the types of formalizations, intent to formalize moves when the benefits that are offered are tangible and valuable from the point of view of citizens. So in that sense, I think that what we are getting, and as I mentioned in the presentation, what we're getting by mixing these types of formalizations to really perhaps underscore the importance of broadening what benefits we're taking into account when thinking about the cost benefit calculation of small firms. So usually, as Juan Sebastian was very sort of in-depth explaining, benefits, we tend to think about them in terms of profit, in terms of access to credit. And I guess what we are showing is that it could be that benefits associated with the specific services, the government services, like access to social security, could be something that is included in the calculation of small firms. So, but thank you for the question.
And just a final question on sort of the details of individual studies. Anna, would you be able to speak a bit more to what you believe explains the results in the DRC study with the property registration?
Sure. That is it's an interesting study because, as I mentioned, we found considerable slippage between intent to formalize and formalization. Property titles are something very valuable. The government offered a simplified program to acquire one of three types of titles that offer different levels of legal certainty to property owners. And this simplified program turns out that it caught in many sort of parts of the titling program officers from the legal cadastral office, and they very much sort of push back on the implementation of this program. So even though we don't have a smoking gun sort of to really test that this is what happened, what we saw, or what the team saw on the field was resistance from these particular offices to the implementation of the program. And then at the end of the day, as I mentioned, they were able to unblock the process, but they required the help from a national minister to really put some pressure on local officers to let the titling process move forward. So I guess this also sort of underscores something that Juan Sebastian was also saying, that it's very important to keep in mind what are the incentives of bureaucrats, and he was talking about oversight bureaucrats, but just generally bureaucrats that perhaps have a stake on keeping the status quo as is.
Thank you, Anna. So we have a series of questions now as we start to think about the implications We have a question from David Alzat at JPAL about the bureaucratic obstacles that may have made formalization more difficult that you had just mentioned, Anna. Like, how can we think of the role of state capacity, things like the efficiency of tax administration or enforcement capabilities? Do we think that this explains a lot of the heterogeneity in results? Similarly, we have a question from Boniface Dulani in Malawi. If the Malawi finding, again, suggests that tax compliance requires multiple interventions rather than just a single intervention on the information and demand side. So I'll pass this first to Juan Sebastian to think about these additional factors, and then to Anna.
Thank you, Shayna. Well, David's question is a very important question, but I think both how easy it is to sort of do these bureaucratic procedures and how strong the state capacity is for enforcement both have a big effect. And I would point out to two very specific examples. So in the case of Colombia, if anyone that's sort of familiar with Colombia would know that the tax code is incredibly complex, and the recent program of it's called the Simple Tax regime for small companies has been quite successful in sort of convincing small firms to register for tax payments for the first time, simplifying the whole process for them, making paying easier, declaring very easy, because sometimes declaring taxes is incredibly complex because of everything that's involved. So really making it simpler for firms could have a big effect. And then in terms of state capacity, I would also again draw the difference between another very good example of that is precisely the May program that Anna that the Brazilian project focused on. That is a system that goes even further. With one single payment, you pay business registration, pay social security contributions, and pay sort of the firm taxes. So that's even simpler, and no wonder that they've had such great success there. But also I would point out that, for example, Brazil and Colombia have very complex tax codes, both countries. But when you look at revenue as a percentage of GDP, Brazil, I think it's double Colombia's, and that there's quite a bit of research that has pointed out the fact that Brazilian capacity for tax enforcement is quite remarkable. So I would point out as evidence that enforcement is also can have tremendous effect on formalization, especially within the tax paying.
And just to add to what Juan Sebastian just mentioned, I think that in our studies, the case of Nigeria and DRC really speak to this question. So in both of these cases, the state has weak capacity to collect taxes. And in Nigeria, they face the additional challenge that market vendors are very much used to interact with leaders from their trade associations, and the state has less presence than these trade associations. So they might feel more compelled to deal with trade association leaders as opposed to state agents. And they actually, in some sense, they do pay fees to these trade associations. So that is an additional layer of complexity that the state faces to increase enforcement, that sometimes there are these other intermediaries that might in a way complicate the task of collecting taxes. In the case of DRC, for example, the government actually only collects every other year property taxes with a campaign like a door-to-door campaign. So as I had mentioned, that might be one of the reasons why we do not find an effect on tax payments in the DRC, because in 2019 they did not collect this door-to-door. They did not conduct this door-to-door campaign to collect property taxes. So clearly capacity here is an important aspect, but it also, I guess, underscores why it's so important to try to also increase voluntary compliance with taxation, because if the state has to go only through the enforcement side of things, then it probably will be very costly to get results in these types of contexts, especially because, as I mentioned, many of the firms that we have in our study, but generally in this context, are small firms, and the proportion of people who are self-employed is really high. And so there's really no shortcuts to get information, like there's no third-party reporting for these types of firms. So it makes the challenge of increasing enforcement among this sector very, very sort of stark and probably very costly.
Thank you both Juan Sebastian and Anna for these responses. I'm really excited to see all of these questions and really dig into how we can take this from 6 studies to what the implications are more broadly. So Juan Sebastian highlighted cost-benefit analysis. And I think we can think of the case of Malawi, where you found that, of course, people preferred to simply dump their trash because it was free and there was no social sanction for it. So I'm wondering, Anna and Juan Sebastian, if you can speak about other interventions, given the results of this Metaketa, are there other approaches that perhaps ought to be tried or ought to be tried in combination to increase tax compliance, not just enforcement, but on the social norms side? Anna, would you like to begin?
Sure. In that specific study that you mentioned, Malawi, one of the things that the PIs considered was including in the intervention some form of nudge to make people think about how acting collectively could be on everyone's benefit, and also trying to help them figure out how to coordinate better to achieve like a positive collective action outcome. So the idea was that maybe if you tell people how many other people have decided to pay the city fee, so that everyone sees that the norm is shifting. So now we're not going to coordinate on dumping the trash on the street, but we're going to coordinate on everyone paying the city fee, and sort of helping people try to make that shift in norms might be useful. And I think that may be one way to get at this issue of social norms, and trying to get people to coordinate on a more socially optimal equilibrium. Yeah.
Go right ahead, Juan.
I think that, look, this problem Malawi is very interesting because that encapsulates the whole problem with formality. So formalization has a lot of positive externalities for society in terms of tax revenue, and that ends up in public investment and public expenditure for all, in terms of environmental benefits also, because formal firms tend to comply a lot more with environmental regulations. It has to do it involves a lot a bigger fraction of the population having social security, so people being less vulnerable to negative to negative things, like, for example, the pandemic. So formality has a lot of social benefits, a lot of positive externalities, and I think the key with formalization policy is it has to do with this vision that Anna's project had, which she stressed at the start, in creating really a functional sort of social contract with people and with firms. And for that, from the standpoint of governments, we really have to ask ourselves, what of these requirements that I'm asking of firms or people are really absolutely crucial for those social benefits, for those positive externalities to really take place, right? So that we can eliminate all the requirements that have been established for one reason or another, but that aren't really sort of connected to that positive externalities that we want to create. That is the first step, right? Asking firms to sort of comply with a lot of requirements that don't really make sense from the social from the social objective standpoint. It's, I wouldn't talk about sort of regulation compliance until we get to that point. And then the second is, well, making those requirements are easy to comply as possible. So reducing bureaucratic costs would be sort of the second step. And then third, making sure that firms are really equipped to materialize the benefits of being formal. So hopefully we can have sort of sort of like a world or a state of affairs or a social contract where firms formalize, because the private benefits that they can materialize from being formal are less than the costs or the fees that they have to sort of incur. And then through that process, society and the economy and the government, materialize all these other social benefits that are positive externalities of that private decision. That's, I think, that a collective action problem really is at the heart of formalization.
Thank you. So we have just a few minutes left, so I don't know that we will get to all of the questions. I would like to highlight that several people have emphasized this social incentive for paying taxes and the potential role of intermediaries such as trade associations, as well as having, considering what benefits, there's a broad benefit to society to paying taxes, but if the benefit doesn't really cleanly apply to the individuals who might pay, it may be more difficult to incentivize them. The example in Colombia of very small businesses, if your individual barber shop is unlikely to expand under any circumstances, the benefit of access to credit may not be much of an incentive to formalization and tax compliance. I am going to give both Ana and Juan Sebastian just 2 minutes each to wrap up before we hit the end of our webinar for today. Juan Sebastian, would you like to begin? And then I'll close out with Ana.
Okay, perfect. No, I think so. I think the key message for me is basically one, that formalization is multidimensional. I think most of the problems with formalization policies and the reason why, in Colombia, we've had formalization policies for more than a decade with very little results. It's because they miss that. They miss that for a firm, it's a long process, a multidimensional process. It's sometimes an overwhelming process. So that's one thing that I would underscore. And then the second one is that firms are rational. And sometimes formalization policies, sort of, the ones that focus on information, on sort of making it easier or assisting firms to do X or Y, I think they miss the fact that most probably firms already know what they need to know and have made a rational decision. Now, maybe that rational decision has to do with wrong perceptions, and in those cases, better information could work. But most probably firms aren't more formal because the incentives that they have in place, or that we as governments, or that markets have set up, there's either a government failure or a market failure that has set the incentives so that they have the level of formality that they have. And if you really want to have a big impact on formalization levels, you have to change sort of those incentives, change sort of or solve the government failure, or solve the market failure that is creating the incentive for keeping firms informal.
Thank you, Juan Sebastian, for that response and for all of your exciting participation in this webinar. It's great to have that policy perspective as well. Ana.
Thank you for inviting me. It was great.
Yeah, so just to, I guess, add to what Juan Sebastian mentioned, I think that the conclusion for us is that the type of demand side interventions could potentially end up promoting formalization and tax compliance. But I guess governments need to keep very much in mind that when in the context there is no such sense of a fiscal contract or a social contract that encourages people to voluntarily pay taxes and their governments to be accountable to voters, then it will be more appealing for citizens to begin thinking about formalization if they receive tangible benefits. So I think that that probably needs to come first before betting only on the socially optimal aspect of formalization and tax compliance. So in that sense, I think what we're really showing here is that what governments offer is important, but governments need to keep in mind that uncertain benefits and collective benefits might fall short, and that very tangible benefits might actually work to stimulate the demand for formalization.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you broadly to the IPA communications team and the EGAP team for bringing all of us together this Friday afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you're located. I hope everyone has enjoyed this webinar as much as I have, and I would like to remind you, as we mentioned at the beginning, that the webinar has been recorded and the slides and the recording will be posted online with both IPA and EGAP. Thank you very much for your participation and have a good weekend.